Hello, everyone. Welcome to Evidence-Based Mental Health's Google Hangout on one of many interesting topics in psychiatry that we've been covering. This session, we'll be talking about impact factor in biomedical journals. Joining us for this discussion is the author of a recent paper in this month's journal, Evidence-Based Mental Health by Seena Fazel, who is a researcher at University of Oxford. We're also joined by Niall, Boyce, who is editor of Lancet Psychiatry, Jin Mali, professor and chair of psychiatry, University of Sydney, who is also the editor-in-chief of the Australia-New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. Again, we're joined by Andrea Cipriani, who's associate professor at University of Oxford's Department of Psychiatry and also the editor of Evidence-Based Mental Health. Good morning, everyone. Seena, you're going to present your paper, I believe, this morning, and we can start a discussion. To everyone who wants to ask questions, please send your questions to through Twitter to hashtag EBMHChat, EBMHCHAT, and I'll pose questions to the panel. Thank you. Go ahead, Seena.
I'll fire away. Okay.
Very good.
Hello, everybody. Really, I sort of became interested in this topic a few years ago. I mean, there was an interesting article in PLOS Medicine about, it was called the impact factor game, and it sort of sparked my interest a bit in how these statistics can be used and how they probably need to be contextualized a bit better. And then in the UK, as probably a lot of people know, we had a big exercise over the last few years to try and rank different departments of universities, and some of that ranking was done on people peer reviewing submissions from individual researchers. And there was a lot of discussion about where the impact factor of a journal came into that equation. And the consensus really was that it should be based on the quality of the piece, but of course people can't read everything that's submitted, so the impact factor is an important thing to consider. And I think the third element, the sort of context, the wider context, is just an issue that individual researchers have, particularly early on in their careers, about where to send things, and do you just go down the sort of pecking order of impact factors, or do you kind of think more carefully about the readership, the journal, and also how much time you're spending in going down the various journal impact factors, submitting to various journals that are probably not quite a right fit for your article. So they're the sort of things in the background, I think. And then, so as a consequence of that, myself and Yele Lamza, who's a researcher here, we put together a sort of alternative ranking of impact factor, because there are more than one. I mean, there is more than one impact factor. There's actually lots of different possible journal impact factors, and they actually come up with slightly different ordering of journals. And I thought it'd be quite interesting just to do a composite score of the main ways that journals are ranked. And Google has something that uses something like the H index. So that's the number of articles that are cited within a 5-year period at a certain level. So if you have an H of 5, it means you've got 5 articles in the last 5 years that are cited 5 or more times. Elsevier has a number of different impact factors that try and normalize it by the field, so that fields where there's less tradition of citing each other are slightly boosted, compared to fields where there's a lot of citations because there's a lot more journals maybe, or a lot more researchers. I mean, that's one of their new impact factors by journal, and they have another impact factor that weights the citation by the journal. So if a very prominent journal cites a piece, it's weighted a bit more into the calculation of the impact factor. We sort of put together this composite score, and we came up with a slightly different list, and I'll try and share it with you now. I don't know if that comes up on your screens, but you can see a ranking using the JIF, which is the Journal Impact Factor. That's a traditional one, which is the top 30 journals in the neurosciences. And then there's a sort of a composite score based on 5 of these impact factors. And you can see on the right the composite score, the ranking being slightly different. And the lines really just point out where things go up or down. That gives you a sort of flavour of where things, where things are different if you use a broader set of impact factors.
Sorry, Seena, to interrupt. We can't see the screen. Can you share the screen?
I will.
So you should have a green. You should have a green button.
Yeah.
On the
yeah,
screen.
Yeah,
very good. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What I wanted to do is to sort of come up as a big. Does that come up or not?
Yes. Yes. No.
Yeah. Okay. So you have the.
You can enlarge a bit because it's very tiny.
Is it too?
No, it's on my screen. I have it.
Ah, okay. You have a big Mac, probably. Okay.
The giant one. You could make it fill the screen, Seena, if you wanted to.
Yeah, but I've tried that, and obviously I haven't been successful.
That's fine.
Okay. The general point is that you have on the left-hand side you have a ranking by the journal impact factor, the traditional journal impact factor, and then in the brackets you actually have the impact factor. This is last year's, not this year's impact factor. So you see New England Journal of Medicine comes up top with an impact factor of about 54, and then it goes all the way down, and these are the top 30 journals in the neurosciences. So that's includes psychology, includes psychiatry, and includes neurosciences generally. So there's a few actual neurology journals there. And then on the right-hand side is the sort of composite score based on 5 of these journal impact factors, and it gives you a different flavour maybe of the ranking of these journals. And you can see some journals do a little bit better and some don't do so well if you use a composite score. And I mean, there aren't. I mean, it's difficult to draw out any themes, but I mean, maybe one of the themes is some of the more clinically orientated journals do a bit better. But the list is very much dominated by review journals, and the general journals also. So the journals that publish across all of medicine and health sciences, they stay on towards the top of the list. So New England Journal, Lancet, and JAMA do well, irrespective of what ranking you use. I mean that's one of the sort of one of the things that we did, and then it made us sort of think about what does it all mean. And I suppose one of the bigger questions is in the real world. I mean, should you go? I mean, should this play a large part in the way you think about where you submit, or should there be other elements to it? And I think one of the interesting things was, I mean, there's been some papers thinking about this, you know, how actually people in the real world do these things. And I put up one, and I'll just summarize it because maybe the abstract's a bit small here. But I mean, they basically argue that when they look at how people actually make decisions in the real world, they balance things like turnaround time, the audience, the target audience, the fit between the article and the journal, and that all comes into a sort of mix. So it's not just one issue that determines where people usually submit. It's a sort of combination of things, and a lot of emphasis around turnaround time, and you know, how well journals sort of add value to whatever you submit. And then you know, I was struck by a piece that came out in BMC Medicine this year. Andrea is one of the co-authors of this, because I think this is also relevant, that there's quite a lot of waste going on in science, and one of the things I think people can think about when they're submitting articles to journals is, you know, what journals are trying to reduce waste and increase value. And what this review does is it looks at meta-analyses of pharmacological treatments, and they see how many of these meta-analyses mention the previous meta-analysis on the same topic. Actually, in the discussion, it was only about a fifth were discussing the previous meta-analysis. I mean, overall, only about 2/3 cited them at all. So you have, you know, important topics, you know, large meta-analyses on these important topics, and people are not even building on the previous work by citing it and then discussing it. And there was a sort of series of papers in the Lancet last year, 2014, where they discussed how people could reduce waste. And I suppose our piece sort of ends with this thought: is that you know, journals that insist that you follow guidelines, insist that you present your results in a rigorous and transparent way, that you know, improve the readability. You know, the readability of the pieces is quite high, and maybe journals that also try and get authors to incorporate reviews of the literature within their paper, so you can actually see how it fits into the bigger picture. I mean, maybe these should be also very prominent features when you're deciding where to submit something. So basically, the article is just really thinking out loud about some of the issues, and I think what we're sort of saying is that people should go a little bit beyond the impact factor and think about these bigger issues to do with you know, whether the journal really adds value, reduces waste, whether your experience or people, and you know, people that you know, their experience has been a good one, i.e. turnaround times are fast, you get good peer review, you know, the editors are actually sort of interested in what's happening. That these are all factors to consider, and not just to rely on one measure that really has, I think, probably dominated the picture a bit too much. So that's pretty much it from me. I mean, it was really just a reflection on some of the things that I think a lot of people go through when they're trying to figure out where to publish.
So my first thought was to ask our editor and chair, Jin Mali, his thoughts about this, because I think, you know, what's the reason that people pick out journals with higher impact factors to publish in? I mean, I assume that it's that people want more exposure, but since most journals are searched and referenced and read online, it seems like it would be most important that you get your paper read and referenced, not necessarily that it's in the journal that itself is read and referenced. And so I was wondering, Jin, if you had comments about that.
So I thought, Seena, that was excellent in terms of the overview, and I read your paper with great interest, actually, because I think it's very relevant to different populations. So, for instance, with the academics, I think one of the key concerns in each of the various countries we are in is what our local funding body dictates in terms of where is it best to publish in order to be able to get recognition by a grant funding body. And our organizations increasingly suggest that you have to publish in overseas journals. Local or parochial journals seem to have less value or impact, even though their impact factor might be quite substantive. The other aspect, I think, with the journals that you've listed there is that, and I like the way you've broken them down into neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, general medicine, because obviously those are different populations. But the other difference between the journals that strikes me is that many are affiliated with organizations, others are quite independent. And that also plays a big role in terms of the scope of a journal. So going back to your original question and the point that Michael's making about what drives submission, often depends also on the audience that you're trying to target in terms of the readership, but also sometimes who you're obliged to publish alongside if you're a member of an organization. So sometimes it's because of it's a college-related article, you might be publishing in a local journal. And certainly, you know, in ANZJP, for instance, there's a real push to try to accommodate overseas views and opinions. But the majority of publications still are very parochial and local. There's to do with Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia issues, not necessarily world issues. And so local authors here, if they're publishing which is something which is relevant worldwide, are more likely to go to an overseas journal than to the ANZJP. So those are the other types of considerations, you know, whether it's actually affiliated with an organization, whether you're part of a society that feeds into a particular journal, and who your readership is going to be, and also what your local funding body might be considering as being appropriate as a competitive publication. Increasingly, the impact factor in itself is not being cited in grant applications. So recently, we've been told by the NHMRC, for instance, that they don't want to know whether or not a journal has an impact factor. What they're really wanting to know is more about the impact of your research, and they're trying to measure that through things like what was mentioned earlier, the H-index, for instance, and your total citations. And so they're using other metrics alongside you know, impact factor. However, when you're reviewing a grant, I think most of us still, if we're not familiar with a particular author, do end up looking at the papers in terms of whether or not they have citations or whether or not they're published in a journal which does have high impact factor. So I think all of those factors are very, very relevant. Question is, you know, what is the key determinant when you're about to submit a paper? And I think everyone does aspirationally go for slightly higher impact factor journals initially and see whether or not the editors and the reviewers like their particular paper.
Right. Niall, do you have comments about this from the perspective of where you are and how you might choose papers and how you position the journal?
Well, my philosophy on choosing papers is very simple, which is that if you have research which I can see is asking good scientific and clinical questions and is robust and really moves things forward, I prefer to think that the impact factor kind of looks after itself in those cases. My focus is always on the individual papers and the quite sort of granular quality there. Clearly impact factors matter to people, but I think that this point which Jin made about impact versus impact is a very interesting one. What's the impact factor that the paper's published in versus the impact the paper has had, you know, in the world? It's interesting, for instance, that today in the UK, last week I think in a journal, a BMJ journal actually called Medical Humanities, a fairly qualitative paper was published on the sort of infiltration of psychological treatments into job centres in the UK, and that today seems to have sparked, you know, protests certainly in London, people on the streets protesting about this, which is interesting because that's something which would not be shown up by any of these traditional metrics. But there you have an example of a publication in a journal which we wouldn't think of, although it's a good journal, we wouldn't think of as being a sort of a Lancet or a Nature type journal. But is that going to have an influence on people? Is that going to have an influence on health policy and employment policy? You know, it's very possible it will. So that's quite an interesting thing if we try to separate out the numbers from what's actually happening out there in the world.
Seena, do you have some comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things someone's mentioned on the Twitter chat, and it's probably worth thinking about as well, about the impact in the real world is how to capture that information, because and a lot of people look at the altmetrics score. So there is a company that track the social media buzz around the paper, and they give it a score. So you get, for instance, 8 if it's in a news article, 2 or 3 if it's in a blog, 1 if it's in Twitter, 0.25 if it's on Facebook, and so you get this sort of added, you get a score, so you know that. And I remember because John Ioannidis was in Oxford recently, and I asked him about what he thought about it, because he's really thought about methodology in some detail, and he said that, you know, he was pretty ambivalent about it, because he thought that maybe it just captures the sort of superficial skim, you know, the sort of skim, the top interest in a, you know, the skimming interest of a paper, rather than the longer term impact. And I just wonder, because it's sort of new. I think a lot of us look at the altmetric score, but I think it remains to be seen how well the high altmetric score actually translates into impact in other ways, including citations. It may be that it's the early altmetric score that's the most useful, rather than the overall altmetric score after a few months. I don't know, but I mean, that it just made me think, when we were talking about impact versus impact, about, I mean, that's of course one way that people are now looking at impact, and it appears on a lot of journals' front pages.
And just to go in there, the interesting thing about altmetrics is that if researchers are trying to convey their findings to the public and to show public engagement with research, if we want to make sure that research is meeting geographically the targets which you're after, if you've got global health research, altmetrics can show you that. It can show you how many members of the public are reading it, and a rough geographical breakdown.
So that suggests that how we look at impact factor might change now that we have the opportunity to look at data from this perspective in a way that wasn't necessarily available before.
Yeah, and in addition, you know, some journals tell you how many people read a paper, so you can actually look at downloads, and I think that's very useful. You know, I mean, that's really hard evidence, you know, because it's you know, it's showing people properly, you know, engaging with it, at least to the extent that they download it and read it. So
right in the olden days, when I was a young man, people had to write on paper to authors to ask them to send them a paper copy of their
of course,
print, of course, right? Or to go to their library. So who knew how often people were actually reading it? We do have a question from the Twitter chat asking about just to review what the definition of impact factor is and how it's calculated in a way so that people who are listening, who may be more from less familiar with it, understand it better. Seena, do you think you could engage with a little education right now?
I think it's this, but I mean, other people can correct me. So if you wanted to work out your impact factor in 2014, you would look at how many articles, how many citations a particular journal has in 2014 from articles that were published in 2012 and 2013. So it's in the previous 2 years. And then you divide that by the, so that you look at the number of citations in 2014 of the articles in the previous 2 years, and then you divide it by the number of articles that were being published in those previous 2 years. So that's my understanding. So the 2014 impact factor is looking at basically articles from 2012 and 2013. And the one thing which I think has improved over time, it wasn't entirely transparent what counted as an article. So what was in the denominator. So you can always figure out what a citation is. That's easy. But what isn't, what I think was less clear is what counts as an article. There's an editorial count, there's a commentary count, there's a letter count, and I think that's actually become much more clear now over time, and so everyone can see. And the interesting thing about one of the impact factors, the one that Elsevier does, which is called impact per publication, they have very strict rules about this, and they only include basically what we think of as research papers, as both counting towards the citations and also being included in the denominator. So they have a very strict rule. about that for that particular impact factor, which is a 3-year one. But the classic one is a 2-year impact factor, and you can also look up the 5-year impact factor as well on the websites, and you can look at the trend and see what's happening over time. But the traditional one is just for that year, 2014, what's being cited from 2012 and 2013.
And so,
I just want.
Go ahead.
So a couple of things that have been said. I mean, going back to Niall's point, and then picking up a couple of things that Seena has just said. I think one of the aspects that we often don't consider and don't really have a good handle on is the time factor. So impact factor is clearly contingent on time, in sense it's sampling a certain period. But one of the things that was just said about news, for instance, or the immediacy of a particular article, that's going through different media altogether. So the impact factor is not going to capture that. And what we're finding increasingly is that articles that have impact, let's say, on social media or current affairs, which are things like editorials, for instance, which can have a huge impact on mental health policy, people's understanding of a particular topic, a social problem that people are facing, or a concern or question. Alternative media are obviously going to be much faster than publication per se, but that effect isn't necessarily long-lasting, and that's a different metric, and we do need that metric alongside the impact factor. They're capturing totally different aspects of a particular article, and we don't really have comparability at the moment. Though you're saying yes, alt metrics and other things can capture that, people don't really have a good understanding of a scale or how to rank journals or what are the best journals in those particular realms. You know, if you wanted to disseminate an article and you realize that this is probably going to have an impact for journalists and social media, which is the best journal to go for in that regard? The other is that that's actually also somewhat unpredictable because of the nature of some of the topics that we address. So, for instance, you've got neuroscience versus, let's say, psychology and psychiatry. You might have a topic which is relevant to society and clinical populations, which gets picked up very quickly. It also has some immediacy. A neuroscience article may actually action as a sleeper. You often find this. Some of the best papers and most highly cited papers over, let's say, a decade or 2 decades are ones that almost went under the radar for the first few years. No one even really cited them, or cited them only occasionally. It's only later on, when a field has caught up, or there's been a certain advance in a certain field, that a paper suddenly picks up in terms of citations and there's a flurry. So I think there are different aspects which even the impact factor misses out, and this is one of the things I think a lot of people have criticisms about the impact factor, is because papers which have impact over a much, much longer period of time are clearly at a disadvantage, even with the impact factor, because it's only looking at that very early window. So if your research is in a field which is rapidly turning over, there's a lot of citations, you're going to get a high impact factor and a lot of citations. If it's something that takes a long time to realize, then it's not going to be picked up. So the time factor is really important.
Yeah, Niall, is there? It doesn't sound like you think about what papers you're going to publish based on that precise definition or problem that Jane is talking about. That is, I don't imagine that you're picking out papers that you think are going to be cited quickly rather than over the long haul, is it?
No, I mean, clearly you want something that moves things forward, and a lot of the time, you know, you're hoping for quick uptake and for quick change in practice where it's necessary. That's something you hope for.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the other thing to bring in here is that I worry a bit about young researchers who get completely wound up about impact factors. So I've been at conferences where people have asked me things like, oh, this is the particular research method that I like using. Is that going to be a problem in my career? and you know, would that be a problem with a journal like yours? And I tend to say, well, you know, is this a research method which is appropriate to the question you're asking?
Right.
You know, and if it is, then don't worry too much about this other stuff. So, you know, I think that the impact factors, I mean, they are you know, a very big detail in a lot of people's minds, but I think we have to look outside it a bit. We also have to look at what authors want. And authors don't always have impact factor as their priority. We've mentioned other things such as getting good quality peer review. People want things done very quickly these days.
Yes.
It's interesting to look at new journals like PeerJ, and part of their sell, if you like, to authors is partially systems. So what they've got is an online submission system, which they're very proud of and which people seem to have a good experience of. And the other thing is there's almost a sort of moral tinge sometimes with people wanting to submit to journals which are open access. There's that sort of thing about submitting to a journal which you agree with ethically as well, which is an interesting trend. So, you know, I think that there are things in life other than impact factors, and maybe they're increasingly important.
Jenny?
Can I add something? Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Just a couple of reflections, really. I mean, the first is partly what Jim was saying, that, you know, what I think I remember when early on in my career, Guy Goodwin said to me, you know, don't forget about some journals arrive on the desk of about, you know, 100,000 people, and that is an important thing to consider. So there are some journals that, you know, because they're part of professional bodies, so, you know, this would apply to the journal you edit, Jim, but also in the UK to British Journal of Psychiatry, and in the US and Latin America and the American Journal of Psychiatry. So they have this advantage where they land on people's desks, and so you might be reaching a completely different audience, a much more sort of practitioner audience, and that has a big advantage. So I mean, that's something to think about, that if you really want to hit, you know, something you're finding has a very practical side to it, and, you know, think about it. But now I'm going to argue against myself as well, because I mean, there was a very interesting piece in Nature. I'll just stick it on our chat, which was talking about the sort of glut of postdoc posts and the large number of PhDs in the neurosciences in particular that I think suffers from this. And so you have this problem, I think, is that there's so many people getting PhDs in the neurosciences, but then so few jobs afterwards, that inevitably, you know, there's large numbers of people applying for very few jobs, and you know, they're going to be applying usually with a CV of just a few publications, and so you can see why they're going to, you know, the emphasis will be on some very simple way of you know, trying to separate out people. And so, you know, I see it maybe a lot more in people applying for, you know, coming up to applying for postdocs, that they're sort of worried about their prospects, and they think that they need a few publications in, you know, high impact journals. And the other thing I want to say, which is sort of again relates to what Jim was saying, is that some journals have press departments and some don't, and so that's something to consider. And some have very good press departments, and that's something to think about as well, because because that, you know, that might be an important way to disseminate a finding with social policy, you know, public policy, public health implications, and it's quite interesting. You know, I've dealt with journals where, you know, the press people have actually been quite difficult to deal with. You know, so the university wanted to press release a paper, and then the press department, this is in the US journal, had a slightly different take on how it should all be done, and in a way it was sort of funny. It was a funny situation, because it sort of potentially could have backfired. So I mean, something to think about, that, you know, does the journal, or is it a family of journals where they have a good press department as part of it? So obviously, you know, the Lancet family of journals has that. The BMJ also does. I know BJ Psych has a press officer, and they're also things to think about.
The Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, if you submit to them, asks for the contact information for your institution's press officer.
Okay.
So, who I didn't know, so I had to go look it up. But you know, they were, you know, so I think some journals are thinking about how they're going to press release the findings that they find interesting also. To go back a bit earlier, your paper looks at a number of different metrics and compares impact factor to these other metrics and sees how much there's a relationship between them. But is impact factor an kind of a metric that might be on the way out in terms of how people are judging the value of journals, especially given what you're talking about here, Seena, which is that it's really only recent references to the recent citations that are counted. Is there some way that it's going to shift to become even faster in terms of judging this, or is there a way to make this a more long-term view of how papers' values are judged?
Well, I think it just needs to be balanced, really. So, I mean, people need to think about all these other areas, you know, the readability, the turnaround time, the audience, the right fit, how much time you want to spend on really sort of chancing it at sort of very good journals that have very low success rates. So, but I mean, I think it needs to be balanced with the other things that I mentioned to do with, you know, the important things about, you know, does the journal really promote good quality research by, you know, insisting on certain things, like you review the literature, you follow guidelines, you present all the results, you just don't present the, you know, the p-values or the risk estimates. You actually present the numbers on which these are based. You know, these are all things which surprisingly doesn't happen very often.
Right.
And so you know, I think in the long term, those papers are going to be really important because they can be much more easily synthesized and made sense of in the future when it comes to people trying to sort of summarize the evidence. I don't think in the short term it is really going to go away. It's such a sort of simple metric, and it's got so much traction. I mean, you know, for good and bad, it's got so much traction. I mean, I work a lot in Sweden, and with Karolinska, for instance. I mean, one of their decisions about whether to press release a paper is whether the journal has an impact factor of 5 or more. And it's just a simple way, you know. I mean, they have to come up with some,
right.
You know, when you've got a huge medical school and lots of stuff coming out. I mean, in Oxford, it seems to be that you know, it's a little bit more qualitative. So you have you know, the press officer will speak to you directly, and you have a discussion, and they're very keen on you know, whether they can actually add something, you know, whether there's something that can be done, and they're also very keen, I think, and I think good press departments are very keen if a piece can be misrepresented, that they can sort of preempt that, and I think that's a very important role for journals, but also press departments, that you make sure in a sort of preemptive way that your piece isn't misrepresented and simplified, and then you know, you can possibly do harm in different ways that are sort of unintended.
One of the other things just to mention, I agree with the points you've just made, is also the publisher's perspective. So it's interesting that, you know, we're talking about the impact factor, and I agree with some of the comments that have been made around overemphasis on it. I think there is far too much emphasis on the impact factor. But if you talk to publishers, there's a range of views there as well. But what's surprising is the impact factor features less on their minds, and there's less importance attached to it, rather than the commercial aspects of a journal. So whether the journal actually will be appealing to a library, whether it can be packaged accordingly, whether it gets reprints, whether it has supplements that can be sold, and whether it's got opportunities for advertising. Those are the things that they're really more concerned about. So journals which, you know, as I think Seena was mentioning, you know, that have a society and a membership are infinitely more attractive purely from that reason alone, because you have a ready market for advertising and promoting a journal. So that's that's a key aspect from their perspective. And it's funny that whenever you talk to publishers around a particular journal, they'll say, well, we quite like this journal, but their reason for liking it is nothing to do with the quality of the science or content or what it's providing. It's more to do with all these other factors. So in that context, the impact factor doesn't have a huge weighting at the moment, and it may well be something that its impact gets diluted because of all the other metrics we're talking about. I think a lot of these metrics are relatively new. Alongside ISI's impact factor, there used to be these other little factors like immediacy, like there's a whole series of columns of impact, but I don't think anyone looked at any of those other than the 2-year impact factor and the 5-year impact factor. Those are the only ones that people were most familiar with. But I think now with the modern technology being what it is, people are getting much more usable and easy to understand metrics, which I think will perhaps inform them around the kind of things we've been talking about. The other aspect I think that Niall mentioned, which I think is quite important, is the ethics of a journal. And there is a swing towards trying to make articles more widely available, and also people wanting their own article not to be limited by a publisher or a publishing house, and have more presence on the net. And I think that's going to be an ongoing trend, and hence why open access journals are so popular and doing reasonably well. The other frustration is that the journals which have a high impact factor, for whatever reason, often obviously reject a lot of papers. And so this is a real frustration for authors and researchers, because they see many, many good papers. And this is a standard line from these journals, that despite your paper having great reviews and being of great importance, unfortunately, because of pressure on space within the journal, we can't accept your article. And though that's true, it's not really easy to stomach, particularly if your research is the culmination of 5-6 years of a clinical trial and you're trying to get some impact or publish it. And it's a very tortuous process to publish in some of these high-impact journals, because you may have to go through several revisions, a lot of interaction with the editor, plus the reviewers, and still face rejection. And that's really another thing that I think is making some of these journals difficult to access and less appealing, just because they're really riding the impact factor, but not looking at the other aspects of what service they perhaps provide the academic community. So I think things will change. It's inevitable they'll change. How they'll change is really going to be difficult to predict, because we don't really know what investment there is going to be in these other metrics.
I've just seen a question on Twitter from Mental Elf, which says, are the papers that have a big impact in the academic world the same as the papers that have a big impact on Twitter? And that's an interesting point to me, because what we have to consider here is something which I call the Christmas issue of the BMJ factor. We all love the Christmas issue of the BMJ, but I think one of the biggest alt-metric or tweeted articles which they did over the past year was the one about chocolates disappearing on hospital wards. And I think that that's an extreme example, but it does demonstrate that things which are tweetable and shareable and create that kind of social media buzz, that there are some points where that does sort of uncouple from things which are clinically useful and will actually advance a particular specialty. So the answer would be, most of the time I'd say things which create a buzz on Twitter are things which are impactful, but there are some pretty notable exceptions to that.
May I ask a question?
I've just put up something that might be amusing, which is I think the most read paper on PLOS One last year was something on nighttime ejaculations of dolphins.
That seems awfully difficult to measure, so hats off to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think your point is that the most cited papers may not be the most, or the most read papers may not be the most important papers.
Well, I think Niall was saying the most tweeted paper was something on chocolate, and here's the most read one, which is on something slightly bizarre. So you often get these outliers, don't you? And I mean, which is actually an interesting point, because actually a lot of the impact factor is driven by outliers generally as well, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
I think you know, I think so. A lot of the better journals, their impact factor is driven by, you know, a handful of very highly cited papers. So that's something else to think about, is that actually the average paper in that journal might not be as cited as you think it might be.
So may I ask you a question? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, sorry. It might be a very naive question, but my take from this conversation is that impact factor can be definitely improved, but it is still what we are looking for when applying for grants or submitting a paper. So it's quite clear from my point of view, which is the interpretation of impact factor from the point of view of the authors. I was wondering which is the point of view of the editors of journals. Which is, if you have a high impact factor, is it only about prestige? Is it something related to other things? I can see the point of having a high impact factor means better articles, better science, of course, but is there anything else?
Niall, do you have a comment?
I'd say my first concern is, as long as impact factors reflect real-world impact and good science, that's my main interest in a high impact factor. Clearly, though, to be honest, having a good impact factor is clearly something you desire, because it's part of creating that virtuous cycle for quality journal that attracts quality submissions and goes from strength to strength in that way. Having said that, to go back to where I started, really, the way I assess articles is really on their quality and their clinical impact, and that's what the other editors here do, and that's what I hope the peer reviewers do as well. That I think when you get into very self-consciously trying to move impact factors around, I think you kind of risk dividing your attention there as to what you should really be doing, which is trying to advance science and practice. And to just reiterate again what I said, I think that if you make sure you've got things which are scientifically solid, which are impactful clinically, then the impact factors will, by and large, take care of themselves and will, by and large, be pretty good.
Right, and then there's also the H index, which is a measure not of the journal but of the author's work itself. And so I understand that that impact factor tends to be used more in places like publications, grant applications. I know it's used in promotion. How would it differ, for instance, from H index? My point is that, I mean, the papers that I have that have been cited the most often are from the highest impact journals in general. But then some of them are not, and some of them are cited more often just because of the content. And this goes back a little bit to what I said earlier, which is that most people are searching for information about a given research topic online through PubMed or some other database. And so as the future moves, as we get farther into the future, how much of an impact is impact factor itself going to have on how people make decisions? And it certainly, I mean, it's had an impact on my H index, but it isn't the only factor involved in my H index.
Yeah, I can see us going far. I mean, we talk about personalized medicine. I think that personalized impact might actually be a trend to watch out for in the future, very, very much so. And that will not only depend on things on H impact, it might even depend on things like social media engagement. Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, Jen, do you have a comment about that? Because I thought what you said earlier was quite interesting.
Yeah, and I agree with you, firstly, that it's very difficult even with your own set of articles to predict which ones will make an impact or get cited. I look at the papers I've published, and one of the papers I published in Acta Neuropsychiatrica with one of my research colleagues was on mindfulness, and it was a very simple review that we'd done largely as a preparation for a grant, and we'd put a fair bit of work into it, and it was a great paper from our perspective in terms of providing us information to put into the grant, and we published the paper in the journal, and at that time the journal didn't have an impact factor that really registered. I think it was about point something or another. So we didn't publish it for impact at all. It was really because we'd done so much work, and it was a good framework to actually publish the article and for synthesizing our own ideas and thoughts. What was really surprising is that year in, year out, that article has been cited, and it's in my sort of top 10 to 12 cited papers. So I'm always stunned by that it's really getting so much interest, and it's purely because of the content. Obviously, mindfulness being an interesting topic, and it's a fairly comprehensive review, and there's not that many that have been as thoroughly researched until more recently. Now I think there are many that have superseded it. But that's just going back to your point about the impact on H-index. So those kind of things also make the H-index somewhat quirky. You can publish occasional papers which attract a lot of citations for all sorts of reasons. One of the things that I think often distorts the H-index is if, for instance, you have published a scale. If you published a scale of assessment or something and it's been taken up, you're assured lots and lots of citations to that scale. But you can argue, has that made a lot of impact per se, or is it just a tool, and therefore as a consequence it's always going to be accruing citations? So I think Niall's point is really important, which is that I think we need to be looking at other metrics alongside any one specific measure. So the H-index is again equally flawed and has strengths and weaknesses just like the impact factor. And I think one of the things, and I'm particularly going back to Seena's paper I like, is this idea of combining metrics and also understanding better the plus points and negatives of each metric. And I think what we've really got to do is, rather than latching ourselves to just one metric and saying this is it, this determines all aspects of what we do, got to understand that what we're doing is extremely complex, and we're meeting the needs of different audiences at different times, in different settings, across different topics. And as a consequence, we need either unitary or combined metrics to measure that. And so different metrics are going to inform us about the salience or the usefulness of a particular article. And that's the sophistication we still haven't got yet. We're still being driven a little bit by learning about this, and also some of the organizations that do drive some of our habits clearly have inertia in terms of catching up and understanding these types of metrics. Just very quickly going to Andrea's comment about what editors think. I mean, when I'm looking at an article, it's exactly the same as Niall, really. It's does it actually excite me, firstly? Is it interesting? But I'm also looking at it from a perspective, and this is probably different to other journals, in the sense that because we do have a captive audience, that's an advantage in terms of an audience to speak to, but it's also a constraint in the sense that we do have to be mindful that we're publishing stuff that's relevant to that audience. So if it's something that's totally unrelated, and let's say all our journal was just on very laptop sort of benchtop type of science, we couldn't really sustain that. The audience wouldn't be happy. All of our members are clinicians. They want to know about clinical problems. And so, each journal, again, and particularly each journal editor, does have to work within a different scope, purely because of the nature of their journal.
Can I go make a little comment about the H-index?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, because it is obviously confounded by age. And it's also, I mean, it's not just tools. It's confounded a lot by how many consortia you're a member of. So
but I do my best to join as many as possible.
Yeah, if you happen to just be in one of the nice genetic consortia, your H-index will, without doing a lot, will be already through the roof. So, I mean, one of the things I saw in someone's CV, I remember that was sent as part of a lecture series we were organising, was that he'd calculated the H-index for where he was first or last author, which I thought was a little bit more realistic, because there, at least the person has had a contribution. Because of course the other problem is, it's irrespective of your contribution to a piece. The H index is just based on, it doesn't matter if you're author 50 out of 100 or if you're first or last author. So I mean, I think it's one of the looser metrics for an individual. And I mean, and what happened in the UK was that the research assessment, the research exercise framework, the assessment framework, they ended up peer reviewing everything. I mean, they decided that metrics were not going to determine how they were going to make the decisions about the quality of research, because I think it was just very difficult to come to some sort of consensus about how to use these various metrics. The other thing I would say about high impact journals is that you do see that people pad introductions often of papers with articles from high impact journals, and it's a way of them trying to say, well, look how important this topic is, because you look at the introduction, it's got 5 references from high impact journals. So there is a slightly sort of self-fulfilling prophecy about publishing in a high impact journal, because then people cite it partly just to justify the importance of their own work. So, and I think the other problem is that because we have so much research out there, I mean, it's been such a, research, the literature is expanding every year. There's more journals, and that although you're saying, Michael, that people will use Medline and PubMed and to find the right papers, I can still see that people are going to be swayed a little bit more in how they search for things by things they recognize, journals they recognize. So I think it's nice to think that everything is done neutrally, but I think that there's a lot of shortcuts have to be taken because there's only there's quite limited time. There's one other thing I was meaning to say, which I suppose is one thing to say about what not to do. So I mean, we're talking a lot about what to do, about taking a balanced view and not just being focused on the impact factor, thinking about. But there's also things you shouldn't do, and I suppose there are 2 that I think worth highlighting. One is just watch out for predatory journals. There's a lot out there. You get these random emails, some of them have been outed. I mean, there's a blog which tries to out them. I'm not going to mention any names here, but watch out, because the peer reviewing process is probably not very strong, and so you end up possibly publishing in a journal that might not exist in a few years as well. So just watch out for predatory journals, get advice maybe from senior colleagues. And the other thing, and I thought this is probably more controversial, and it's not my view, but there was a very interesting piece by Dorothy Bishop, who's a prominent neuroscientist here in Oxford, and she said, one of the things I always say to my junior staff is don't publish chapters in books, because they don't tend to be read very widely, and they don't tend to be cited. So maybe 2 things to consider to people in particularly early on in their careers is watch out for predatory journals, and think twice maybe about a chapter invitation.
Can I add a comment? Because one of the things that have been raised was about the peer review process, and I have to say that sometimes you look for high impact journals because the peer review is usually better, so to speak, and it is not always the case. But what I discovered, and I don't know if it's something that makes sense to you, is that usually the peer review process is something that is aimed at finding weaknesses rather than highlighting the strengths of the paper. But sometimes you have a very good peer review process if the editor behind the journal has a strong vision, strong view. And this is something I'd like to be considered in an impact factor of a journal, if the editor has a vision, which is very interesting also for the researchers to have a relationship with the editor and try to improve science. That would be really fascinating and interesting from my perspective, I think.
I think that's great. Any final comments before we wrap up this this hangout? today? Niall, Seena?
No, I mean, I think one of the things is that you always have to, as with, it's a bit like medicine, you need to update your methods according to the way the world changes. You know, nothing stays the same for very long, and I think it would be a shame if impact factors are hugely important. I think we've established that, but at the same time, it would be a shame if we don't have open minds about new ways of measuring research impact, new metrics, new ways of thinking about this whole question. And I would end with a plea that all of us researchers and publishers continue to do that.
Well, I think that's a terrific way to end, and I want to thank people for joining. Niall Boyce, Jin Molly, Seena, Fazel, Andrea, Cipriani, and thanks again to Holly Millward for helping us put this all together. And we'll see you at our next Google Hangout, and follow us on Twitter at ebmentalhealth_BMJ. Thanks very much.
Thank you.